Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know how we do things around here? We take one fascinating piece of research and we really unpack it.
Yeah, we roll up our sleeves and get into the details.
And today, well, we're looking at something titled, and get ready for it, Job Creation During a Climate Compliant Global Energy Transition Across the Power, Heat, Transport, and Desalination Sectors by 2050.
Wow, it's a mouthful.
It is right. But don't worry, we're going to break it all down. Basically, this study is all about what happens to jobs as we shift to 100% renewable energy by the year 2050. In line with the Paris Agreement and all that. It's a big question. Lots of people are curious about it. And this study digs into those economic changes that come along with trying to tackle climate change.
Absolutely, and I think what's so valuable about this particular study is that it really tries to cut through the noise. You know,
Mhm.
there's a ton of information out there, and sometimes it's hard to see the forest for the trees.
Yeah, for sure.
But this study tries to give us a clear picture of what's actually happening on the ground, especially when it comes to employment.
So where do we even begin with something like this? This study points out that back in 2020, there were about 57 million energy jobs globally. That's across power, heat, transport, and desalination. And that's just counting the direct jobs, the ones directly tied to those energy technologies.
Right, and that's a really important distinction to make because, of course, there are all those other jobs that get impacted indirectly.
Yeah, like the folks who build the roads to get to a wind farm or the people making the components for solar panels in factories. But this study really zeroes in on those jobs at the heart of our energy systems.
And what it finds is that by 2050, we could see that number jump to almost 134 million direct energy jobs. That's more than double.
That's a huge increase, and it really underscores this idea that renewable energy isn't just about saving the planet, it's also about creating economic opportunities.
Absolutely. And one of the key reasons for this job growth, which this study digs into, is that renewable energy technologies are, by their nature, often more labor intensive than fossil fuels.
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. So think about it. When you extract oil or coal, it's a pretty centralized process. You have these large facilities, and yeah, you need workers, but it's not as distributed as something like solar, where you have installations happening on rooftops all over the place.
Oh, I see.
Plus, there are more steps involved in manufacturing, installing, and maintaining those renewable systems. It's just, it's a different kind of energy system that requires more hands-on deck, so to speak.
Makes sense. Okay, so big picture, this study reminds us that the energy sector is a massive contributor to those greenhouse gas emissions. We're talking over 3/4 of the total globally. And what's becoming increasingly clear is that we can't just look at energy transitions through a technical lens, right?
Right. We have to consider the social and economic aspects as well. It's all interconnected.
This study digs into that for sure. Now, you mentioned direct jobs earlier. Can you explain a bit more about the different types of jobs they're looking at here?
Yeah, so direct jobs are those directly involved in producing, installing, operating, and maintaining a specific energy technology. Think of the folks putting up solar panels or running a geothermal power plant. Then you have indirect jobs, which are in industries that supply goods and services to the energy sector. So, making steel for wind turbines or providing financial services to a solar company. And finally, there are induced jobs, which are created because of the overall economic activity generated by the energy sector. So as people working in energy have more money to spend, that creates demand in other parts of the economy, leading to more jobs in restaurants, retail, and so on.
Wow, so it's like a ripple effect.
Exactly. This study primarily focuses on those direct jobs, but it acknowledges that the indirect and induced effects are also significant.
So how do they actually measure all these jobs?
They use an approach called the employment factor, or EF. Basically, it's about figuring out how many jobs are created per unit of energy produced or capacity installed. So, for example, they might say that for every megawatt of solar PV installed, you create X number of jobs in manufacturing, Y number in installation, and Z number in operation and maintenance.
So it's about understanding the job intensity of different energy technologies.
Exactly. And what I think is really impressive about this study is how comprehensive it is. They don't just look at electricity generation like some other studies. They also factor in things like heating, transport, desalination, energy storage, and those newer power-to-X technologies.
Right, so it's a much broader view of the energy system.
Yeah. And they also consider jobs related to decommissioning old fossil fuel infrastructure, as well as the jobs created in expanding transmission and distribution networks to get all that renewable energy to where it needs to go.
It sounds like they've really tried to capture the full picture of how these job shifts might play out.
They certainly have. They even take into account things like regional labor productivity, which is how efficiently people work in different parts of the world, and technology learning effects, which is how technologies become more efficient and cheaper over time.
Wow, that's getting pretty nuanced.
Yeah, and all of this analysis is underpinned by something called the LUT Energy System Transition Model, which is a pretty sophisticated tool that allows them to model different energy scenarios with a lot of detail.
Tell me more about that.
So the LUT model looks at 145 different regions around the world, and it breaks down energy demand and supply on an hourly basis. So they can see how much energy is needed at different times of day, where it's coming from, and what the implications are for things like jobs. This high level of detail allows them to create a really granular picture of how the energy system could evolve.
That's impressive. And the specific scenario they explore in this study is one where we reach 100% renewable energy across all sectors: power, heat, transport, and even desalination by 2050. So, a pretty ambitious goal, but it gives us a good benchmark to see what the job implications could be.
Exactly. So with that in mind, let's jump into what this study tells us about how specific sectors might be affected.
Sounds good. Let's start with power, since that's usually what people think of first when they talk about renewable energy.
Right, and this is where this study projects some of the most dramatic changes. They estimate that the power sector could see a jump from 20 million jobs in 2020 to 69 million jobs in 2050.
Wow, that's more than triple the number of jobs.
It is. And the main driver, according to this study, is solar photovoltaic or solar PV. They project that solar PV could account for about 60 million of those jobs by 2050.
So solar is going to be a huge job creator.
Yeah, and they break it down further, looking at utility-scale solar, which are those big solar farms you see, and prosumer solar, which is smaller installations on rooftops and such. They estimate that utility-scale solar could account for about 44 million jobs, and prosumer solar could add another 16 million.
So a mix of big projects and smaller, more distributed installations.
Exactly. And while solar is the big story here, they also see job growth in wind energy, particularly in the first half of this decade. However, they expect that growth to stabilize as solar becomes increasingly competitive.
Okay, and what about some of those other renewable technologies like hydropower, geothermal, and bioenergy?
They see those as providing a steady stream of jobs throughout the transition, though not on the same scale as solar.
Now, what about jobs in traditional energy sources?
That's where the news is not so good. This study projects a sharp decline in jobs related to coal and gas power, mainly due to the decommissioning of those plants. And they also see a near elimination of nuclear jobs, driven primarily by economics.
So a real shift away from fossil fuels and nuclear.
Yes, and by 2050, they estimate that solar PV could account for a whopping 87% of total power generation jobs, essentially replacing coal as the leading employer in the sector.
Wow, that's a pretty stark transformation. Now, what about the heat sector?
That's an interesting one because this study projects an initial decline in jobs as we electrify more of our heating. However, as that process picks up steam, they see an overall increase to about 28 million jobs by 2050.
So a bit of a dip and then a recovery.
Right, and the jobs that are being created are in things like heat pumps, electric heating systems, and solar thermal technologies.
So again, a shift toward electrification.
Exactly. And they also see a reduction in jobs related to combined heat and power, or CHP, which is where you generate both heat and electricity.
Why is that?
They attributed to the greater integration of power and heat sectors and the adoption of more efficient alternatives.
Yeah.
Basically, as we become more efficient, we need fewer of these specialized plants.
Makes sense. Okay, what about energy storage? That seems like it would be a big part of a renewable energy future.
And they project massive growth in this area. Nearly 10 million jobs by 2050, in fact.
10 million? That's a lot.
It is, and the vast majority of those jobs are related to battery technology, both at the utility scale and the smaller prosumer scale.
Right, like those big battery farms we're starting to see more of.
Exactly. And it's important to note that this doesn't even include battery jobs in the automotive industry, which would be on top of this.
Okay, so storage is definitely a growth area for jobs. Now, what about fuel production? That seems like it would be a sector where we see some significant job losses.
You're right. They project that jobs in fossil fuel production will decline from about 18 million in 2020 to just 4 million by 2050.
That's a big drop.
It is, but it's not the whole story. They also see the emergence of a new sector focused on e-fuels.
E-fuels, what are those?
They're synthetic fuels produced using renewable electricity. Think of things like hydrogen, synthetic natural gas, and Fischer-Tropsch fuels.
So instead of extracting fossil fuels, we're creating new fuels using renewable energy.
Precisely. And they estimate that this new e-fuel sector could create over 3.6 million jobs by 2050, helping to offset some of those losses in traditional fuel production.
Interesting. And finally, what about the infrastructure needed to support all this renewable energy, the transmission and distribution grids?
They project significant growth there as well. They estimate an increase from 5 million jobs in 2020 to 22 million by 2050.
So we need a lot more people to build and maintain those grids as we electrify more of our economy.
Exactly. And this is all part of that bigger picture of a more decentralized and interconnected energy system.
Okay, so we've looked at the sector-specific changes, but let's zoom out a bit and talk about the overall energy value chain. Where are those jobs being created along that chain?
Well, they break it down into a few key categories. First, you have manufacturing, and they project significant growth there, from 6 million jobs in 2020 to over 23 million in 2050.
So lots of jobs making solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and all the other components.
Right, and they also anticipate a shift toward more localized manufacturing, which could further boost local job creation.
Then there are the jobs in operating and maintaining all this new infrastructure.
Exactly, and that's actually projected to be the biggest job category by 2050, with about 42 million jobs globally.
And of course, we need people to build all this stuff.
Right, construction and installation are projected to reach over 40 million jobs by 2050.
So it's really a comprehensive transformation of the energy workforce.
It is, and as you might expect, the biggest job losses are in fossil fuel production and supply, which they project will shrink from about 32% of total energy jobs in 2020 to just 3% by 2050.
And they also point out that global fossil fuel export jobs will essentially disappear as countries transition to domestic renewable sources and e-fuels.
Right, so there will be a need for economic diversification in those regions that are currently heavily reliant on fossil fuel exports.
Now, one of the most interesting findings in this study is that they project a significant increase in the number of jobs per unit of energy consumed.
Yeah, they estimate that it will go from 563 jobs per terawatt hour in 2020 to 1,000 jobs per terawatt hour in 2050.
So basically, a renewable energy system creates almost twice as many jobs for every unit of energy we use.
That's right, which makes a strong case for the economic benefits of a renewable energy transition.
Now let's talk about how this might play out in different parts of the world.
They see some pretty big regional variations. For example, they project that Europe's share of global energy jobs will increase from 7% to 12% by 2050.
Why is that?
They attribute it to high levels of electrification and domestic e-fuel production. Eurasia, on the other hand, is projected to see an initial decline in its share due to its role as a fossil fuel exporter, but then they see it stabilizing as it transitions to renewables and e-fuels.
Okay, and what about the Middle East and North Africa, another major fossil fuel exporting region?
They also see a decline in their share, from 7% to 5%,
Yeah.
due to the decline in fossil fuel exports. But they do see an increase in the total number of energy jobs within the region.
And where do they see the biggest growth in job numbers?
Sub-Saharan Africa. They project that jobs in that region will jump from 2 million in 2020 to 12 million by 2050.
Wow, that's a huge increase.
It is. And it's
Yeah.
largely due to the potential for building new renewable energy infrastructure in a region where much of the energy system is still developing.
So a lot of opportunity for economic development in that region. What about Asia?
They project continued growth in SAARC and Northeast Asia, which together account for about half of global energy jobs. They see that share staying relatively stable, but the total number of jobs more than doubles.
And what about Southeast Asia and the Pacific?
They see a slight decline in their share, partly due to the presence of coal exporting countries, but they still project an increase in the total number of jobs.
Okay, and what about the Americas?
They see North America's share staying pretty stable at around 10%, with total jobs doubling. South America, on the other hand, sees a slight decline in its share, partly due to losses in fossil fuel exports, but they see potential for growth in renewables.
So some regions might see a shift in their global share, but pretty much everywhere they see a net increase in jobs.
Right, and it's important to remember that all these projections are based on a specific scenario, one where we reach 100% renewable energy by 2050. If we don't achieve that goal, the job numbers could be different.
Now let's talk about where those jobs are coming from in terms of energy sources.
They see renewable energy technologies as the biggest job creators, accounting for nearly 100 million jobs by 2050. Fossil fuels and nuclear, on the other hand, see a significant decline, accounting for just 3% of jobs by 2050.
So a real sea change in the energy workforce.
Absolutely. By 2050, they project that renewables will account for about 75% of all direct energy jobs, up from about 45% in 2020. They also see big job growth in energy storage and transmission and distribution.
And they highlight the potential benefits of local manufacturing, particularly for regions like Northeast Asia, SAARC, Europe, and Southeast Asia.
Yeah, they find that if those regions can develop strong local manufacturing capabilities, they could see even greater job creation.
Now, how do these findings compare to other studies on this topic?
This study generally projects higher job numbers than some others, and they attribute that to a few factors. First, they consider a wider range of technologies, including energy storage and e-fuels. Second, they're looking at a scenario with high electrification and a fully renewable final energy demand. And third, they're using a very detailed model that allows them to capture regional variations and technology learning effects.
So the specifics of the scenario and the methodology can really influence the results.
Absolutely. But overall, there seems to be a consensus that renewable energy creates more jobs per unit of energy than fossil fuels.
And they point out that we're already seeing this trend play out in countries like Chile, Japan, and the US, where solar is creating more jobs than coal.
Right. And it's important to remember that these are just the direct jobs. The indirect and induced job creation could be even greater.
So a lot of potential for economic growth alongside climate action.
Precisely.
Mm.
And their initial job estimates for the 2015-2020 period seem to line up pretty well with data from international organizations like IRENA and the ILO, which gives us some confidence in their methodology.
Now, thinking about the implications of all this, what are some of the challenges and opportunities that this shift presents?
One of the biggest challenges is going to be reskilling and training workers who are currently employed in the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, we need to make sure those workers have the skills they need to transition to jobs in the renewable energy sector.
Exactly. And that's going to require investment in education and training programs, as well as policies that support a just transition for those workers.
But the opportunities are also immense.
Absolutely. This transition has the potential to create more stable and localized jobs, which could boost economic growth, particularly in developing countries, and it could lead to a more skilled workforce overall.
So a lot to be optimistic about.
Definitely. And it all comes back to that core finding of this study, that job creation during a climate-compliant global energy transition across the power, heat, transport, and desalination sectors by 2050 has the potential to create a significant net increase in employment globally.
So as you think about the future of energy and employment, take some time to consider what these shifts might mean for your own community, what new skills might be in demand, what new industries might emerge. This study suggests that there's a huge economic opportunity alongside the imperative to address climate change, and digging deeper into the regional specifics could be really insightful.
I agree. It's an exciting time to be thinking about these issues. And it's clear that the transition to a renewable energy future has the potential to create a more sustainable and prosperous world for everyone.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.